Hey guys! So today you and I are going to talk about top technology companies. So let's get into it. So the question in question was, hi Frederick, what technologies would you say a top software development company should be proficient in? Well, I would say that if we go with the obvious stuff, which is for me, it's going to be web development, so front and back end work and DevOps or operations sort of stuff. The main things that I can go through is that for front-end developers is the same thing that most companies are working with today. So you're going to need to know your SPAs like Angular, Vue, React, etc., etc. You're going to have to be pretty solid in CSS and like mobile first development and so forth, and like responsive designs and all that good stuff. And I mean, this has been the general setup for at least 10 years, so nothing really new there. And for the backend, it's the same deal. You're going to have to specialize or like get pretty good at some backend languages, ideally the ones that are most in demand. And then you're going to need to know your databases, depending on what you mean by top software development company. I can tell you that the main databases that most of the industry is running today is going to be a relational type, a document type, or a key value type, which is usually for session management or similar sort of things. I've still to this day only seen one or two situations where a graph database has been used. Vector databases are coming in and as part of AI and so forth, but it's not something that I'm all that familiar with. And these are the main technologies, and then if for development purposes in like operations and cloud infrastructure and similar sort of things, you're going to need to know at least one or two cloud providers, depending on what customers you have and so forth. It might vary. Luckily for you, most of the transitions are pretty simple. I'm not going to say that it's like a perfect mapping, but most services are on both sides of the spectrum, so it doesn't matter if you're on like Azure or AWS. They're going to cover you with most of what they're doing. That there are differences, but it's not. I've never found it to be much of like a transition period to go from one to another. And I've worked with GCP, AWS, and Azure at this point. I'm not going to claim that I'm equal in all of them, but it's not. I argue it's not that much that hard to transition. So once you have your cloud providers and similar sorts of things, you're going to have to need to know your fundamentals about CI and CD pipelines. Like, in other words, do you know how to deploy things continuously and do so in a secure way and so forth and so forth. And then, of course, we can go and start talking about the stuff that I find more interesting, because these things that I've talked about now, those are the basics of the basics. If you want to do serious web today, like every single major IT company is going to have that set up in some way or form, usually, unless they're like running an on-prem thing or so forth. And so for me, whether or not that makes you a top software company or not, we can debate that. The thing that usually I argue for, if you're going to be a top company or not, has less to do with what you might imagine, like using cool languages, because that's the thing that all the consultancies are doing in my part of the world at the very least. They define top as being on the latest trends and having the coolest languages and doing cool hackathons and building with cool tools and stuff like that, right? To me, that is not what makes you a top IT company. The thing that makes you a top IT company is, number one, do you have your development processes and like your ability to ship code down to a T? Are you like top notch when it comes to development practices? And the second thing is shit you build. What are you building? No one is ever going to claim that. I'll give you a good example. The retirement branch of my government here in Sweden, they had a tech talk which was probably one of the best tech talks I've ever seen on testing, proving to me that although they are probably not building a very cool system, like I depend on it and a lot of other people depend on it, so when I get even older than I am, I'm going to need to use their system. And although it's probably not one of those cool systems like Google stuff or YouTube or Spotify or whatever you're using when you're watching this, they proved the first thing. They understood how to test things, because they understood how to develop software with high levels of quality, which is rule number one. And that is to sort of go through all of that with you. That's basically what my little channel here is about. I've had plenty of people ask me, how do I build good software, how do I make it stable, and so forth and so forth. And the reality is that the way that you do it is how all the major players have done it. You hire true masters of the craft, and then you listen to those masters of the craft, and you set up work processes that reflect the sort of practices that they follow in order to be among the best. And I argue that in that video they showcased that they had some people there that at the very least conceptually understood how to do testing at a level that was higher than, I mean, shit guys, I've worked for startups that were all that and the coolest and so forth and so forth, and they were laughably incompetent when it came to number one, which is to ship working quality software without a lot of pain and friction. They might have had a cooler project. That's the thing that I argue most people should be looking for, because the thing that you usually recruit the top brass software developers with is, apart from money, which I hope is obvious, is cool technology and the type of project that you're building, like what does your system do. And for you to be a top achiever in software quality, like as a top company, the things that I've mentioned, these are a starting point, and everything else comes down to understanding, all right, so how does software developer do work? Which technologies do you need to use, like, in order to make sure that, you know, everything from how do you set up these CI pipelines? How do you make sure that the test coverage is good, or like the testing strategy is working? How do you make sure that you only hire people who really know what they're doing? And how do you make sure that they spread their knowledge? And how do you make sure that you get the right office culture? All of this sort of stuff. That's the sort of stuff that you see from like Google and Microsoft and all these bigger companies. That's the real challenge. Not which language you're using or like which front-end framework you're using. That is secondary, because most of the tools on the market, guys, like, although there are differences and some of them fairly major for sure, there is not, like, the differences are so great that you're like your second tier company if you go with, I don't know, React instead of Angular or vice versa or something similar. Those sort of trade-offs are usually only discussed on, like, you know, coffee breaks between various developers, or on like newsletters or other pointless forums where like they debate endlessly about which choice in technology that is the best of the best and the best. And I always find some way of trolling them by saying that, oh, you know, that company, they went from, I think it was a Netflix, they went from Node to Java. How about that transition, right? Because Node was all the shit 10 years ago, at least when I started. And then the Node was not cool anymore. Then was Golang, and that's super cool now, right? And I mean, who knows when they're going to migrate away from that? So those sort of discussions, they don't signify for me a top level company. It is like very secondary what language you're using or which specific framework you're using, assuming now that you're not like on, I don't know, working in Dreamweaver or like back in jQuery days and so forth and so forth. But once that part is done, then it's all down to how successful is your product, what features do you develop, how sophisticated are they, and so forth and so forth. And the closest thing to a top IT company you can be right now, if you want to talk about like coolness and stuff, you're going to be in AI. At least right now, AI is the shit. It's the if you ask me, it is the new browser wars. Holy shit! Every single IT company under the sun has an AI solution, which if they, I truly hope that you, like sales rep for your various companies that do this, pray that you never see this mug in one of your Zoom meetings with the customer when you're trying to sell a AI as something, because I will eat you alive if I see that you're actually not doing AI at all. You're just forwarding the call to ChatGPT. So what I want you to take away from this is that top IT companies with the technologies they should have a knowledge of is basically the same as for the software developers. Number one, front-end developers, make sure you know your SPAs, make sure that you know how to do like CSS and like responsive layouts and mobile first and all that good stuff, Node.js, TypeScript, all of this sort of stuff, right? Like you can check the job postings. I always say the same thing. Go to the job postings, they will showcase most of what is being used today. And then for the backend developers, pick a web language. My personal favorites that I usually recommend is Java and C# if you want to be like really, really safe, because they're pretty established languages and they will do the job in practically every situation if you know, My personal stack is always going to be a full TypeScript with Node.js backend, but I'm a little bit like careful with recommending that to the average company due to the fact that I, on average, argue that JavaScript developers are pretty shit at computer sciencey concepts like object-oriented programming and so forth and so forth. So they tend to muck it up a little bit, if I may say so. That's why I was lucky that I didn't just learn JavaScript. I learned a few other stuff that taught me how to do it well in JavaScript as well. I will argue at the very least. And then databases, the main ones are going to be relational databases. Get good at those, and most of your customer needs are going to be met by that. And document databases is the secondary one. Be very careful with these two because people are usually very good at picking something like MongoDB when they're actually looking for a Postgres or something similar, and then they're like, the best way to figure out if you've made the wrong choice is, do you need more than one query to the database, your document database, to get the whole object structure? Do you have like ID or arrays or IDs or something like that on your JSON? Cool, you should have gone with a relational database. And for key value stores like Redis and EDCTS, I can't remember now, ATCD, something so forth. Key value is very common as well for like caching purposes of like information that you need to have fairly readily available, like in memory type of stuff, which is usually sessions, similar sort of things. And well, you can be very cool and progressive if you use a graph database, but honestly, they're a little bit niched if you ask me at the very least. And then apart from that, DevOps oriented like style of working where the developers have a good cloud provider that they can use, like they understand how to develop with it. Make sure that you have CI and CD pipelines and like you run automated testing, all that good stuff and so forth. And then like the rest of it really comes down to having good people who know how to safely develop things, who know how to do rollbacks and like set up like all the bells and whistles with log systems and so forth and so forth. There's a ton of stuff, guys, and that's why I can't give you all of it in one little setting here. That's the main thing that you should focus on. And then the secondary thing, which is, I would argue, even more important, because this stuff is sort of, everybody does this. The thing that really sets you apart as a top IT company is, what are you making? Are you making cool stuff? If you're making cool stuff, that makes you a cool company. Have a great day.